Okay, so you want to conquer Troy, launch 1,000 ships, land the greatest army the Bronze Age has ever seen, build a Trojan horse, torch the place, sail home rich. That's the pitch, and it's the version that just filled IMAX screens worldwide. Here's the problem. Nobody actually launches a 10-year, 100,000-man invasion over a girl. Troy was sitting on something every kingdom in the Aegean needed, and the woman was never the deal. Here's the reframe, and it comes from a source you wouldn't expect. Centuries later, a Greek general named Thucydides looked back at this whole campaign and basically said, "This wasn't a war, it was a cash flow problem that lasted a decade." His read was blunt. The Greeks showed up with a massive army on paper, but they never actually had the money to keep that whole army fed and fighting at once. So for 10 straight years, they were running half a war, one half of the force on the siege line, the other half constantly getting pulled off to go farmland nearby or raid smaller towns just to keep everyone from starving. His conclusion is almost an insult to the myth. If they'd shown up properly funded, they take Troy in a fraction of the time. The 10-year siege wasn't proof the Trojans were tough. It was proof the Greek coalition was chronically undercapitalized. Once you see it that way, the whole story reads differently. This wasn't an epic. It was a decade-long venture that never solved its burn rate problem. And almost everything else about how it played out flows from that one fact. Let's start with the capital outlay, because launch 1,000 ships is doing a lot of hiding in that sentence. Homer's own count puts the fleet at just under 1,200 ships. Round numbers, sure, but even if you're skeptical of the exact figure, the order of magnitude is the point. This is not a task force. This is close to every seaworthy hull in the Greek world pulled off whatever it was doing, fishing, trading, sitting in a boathouse, and repurposed for a single venture with no fixed timeline and no guaranteed return. You don't have a navy sitting in reserve. Every ship gets built or refitted from scratch, timber felled and seasoned, a crew trained, and, most expensively, everyone on board armed in bronze. And bronze is where the real money problem starts, because bronze isn't one material, it's two. Copper, which is everywhere, and tin, which is basically nowhere. The nearest reliable tin supply to the Aegean sits thousands of kilometers away, hauled in from mountains in Central Asia or shipped up from as far as Britain. So every sword, spearhead, and breastplate your coalition needs isn't a local purchase. It's an import at the end of a supply chain longer than the war itself. Multiply one warrior's basic kit across every kingdom sending troops, and the metal bill alone bankrupts half your allies before a single ship clears the harbor. Then there's the crew cost. Every one of those 1,200 ships needs a full crew just to reach Troy in the first place. Dozens of armed men per hull, all needing to be fed and equipped from day one, months before the siege has even started. That's tens of thousands of men fleet-wide, every one of them drawing full rations and full bronze before anyone's even seen the walls of Troy. You're not funding an army. You're funding an army that has to get itself there under its own power first, out of a Bronze Age treasury that runs on stored grain and traded metal instead of anything liquid. There's one more structural problem sitting underneath all of this, and it's not a cost line item. It's a governance problem. Agamemnon isn't the CEO of this venture. He's more like the largest individual investor in a joint venture made up of dozens of independent, equally sovereign kings, each of whom showed up with their own fleet, their own troops, and their own separate interests. Nobody actually works for Agamemnon. He can request, cajole, and occasionally guilt other kings into compliance, but he has no real enforcement mechanism if a major contributor decides the deal isn't working for them anymore. That's not a minor footnote. That's the single biggest operational risk in the entire venture, a 10-year, 100,000-man campaign, run not by a chain of command but by a loose coalition of co-investors who can at any point simply take their fleet and go home, which repeatedly, several of them threaten to do. So the fleet sails, the army lands, and now the real problem kicks in, because this is where the business actually breaks. Here's the part almost nobody accounts for going in. You'd think the hard part is the fighting. It isn't. The hard part is payroll, feeding over 100,000 men plus horses for a full decade on foreign soil with zero supply chain running back home. There's no treasury wiring monthly grain shipments to the beachhead. Armies in this world live off the land, which works fine for a 6-week campaign and becomes an existential problem the second you're still there a year later. This is exactly the mechanic Thucydides is describing. With no way to keep the whole force supplied at once, the army splits itself, constantly. One half holds the siege, the other half goes and works, clearing farmland nearby, or raiding smaller towns up the coast for grain and livestock they can convert into supplies. That's not a subplot. That's the operating model. And a besieging force that's only ever fighting with half its headcount, because the other half is out foraging, isn't actually laying siege to anything effectively. It's running a rotating supply mission that occasionally remembers there's a war on. Run the math on what that actually means for the timeline. If the coalition genuinely fielded its full 100,000-man force against Troy's walls every single day, the myth's own math suggests the city falls fast. Thucydides says as much directly. Instead, you get 10 years, because on any given day a huge share of that headcount isn't fighting at all. It's out threshing grain or torching a fishing village for its stored food. You didn't hire 100,000 soldiers. You hired 100,000 soldiers and then spent most of the war using half of them as an improvised logistics division instead. You can see this baked directly into the plot. The Iliad doesn't open in year 1 of the siege. It opens in year 9, in the middle of a fight over looted plunder from a raid on a completely different town. Not Troy. Some smaller target sacked purely for supplies. The entire inciting incident of the war's most famous story is a resource allocation dispute. Achilles and Agamemnon aren't arguing strategy. They're arguing over who gets which prisoner and which cut of the raided goods, because supply raids had become such a routine part of the operation that fights over the spoils could nearly blow up the entire coalition. And look at what actually happens next, because it's the cleanest business metaphor in the whole story. Achilles is, by a wide margin, the single most valuable asset the coalition has, and the second he feels shorted on his cut, he doesn't negotiate. He pulls his entire contingent out of the fighting and sits it out. Your single best performing unit just walked over an equity dispute in year 9 of a 10-year build, and the rest of the campaign visibly struggles without him until he's talked back in. That's not a tragic character flaw. That's what happens when a venture's most critical talent realizes the payout structure is arbitrary and enforced by whoever happens to be holding the title of commander that week. The epic of heroes opens on what is, underneath the poetry, a fight over who owns which line item, and a walkout by the coalition's most important contributor. Which raises the obvious question. If the burn rate was this brutal, what was actually worth 10 years of bleeding cash to take? Look at where Troy actually sits, right at the mouth of the strait connecting the Aegean to the Black Sea. A choke point so narrow, almost nothing moving between those two trade regions could avoid passing directly under Troy's walls. Grain, metal, timber, livestock, all of it funnels through a gap. Troy is perfectly positioned to tax, control, or simply seize. That's not a sleepy coastal town. That's a toll booth sitting on top of the single most valuable shipping lane in the Bronze Age world, fortified with walls big enough that taking it was never going to be quick or cheap. Think about what that setup actually looks like in modern terms. A narrow strait that a huge share of a region's critical imports has to physically pass through, controlled by one heavily fortified operator, with no easy way to route around it. That's not a myth-only arrangement. That's the kind of choke point modern economies still build entire military strategies around today, just with grain and bronze standing in for oil and semiconductors. Whoever runs that strait isn't just collecting tolls. They're sitting on the single point of failure for every other kingdom's supply chain, which means every other kingdom has a standing incentive to either buy them off or take them out. And taking them out is exactly what a decade-long coalition-funded siege actually is. That's the actual acquisition target, not Helen. Leverage over the one trade corridor every kingdom in the region depends on, in an economy where the single most critical raw material has to travel across half the known world just to reach you. Taking out the city sitting on top of that choke point isn't about pride. It's a hostile takeover of critical infrastructure, and infrastructure like that is worth almost any price to control, which is exactly why nobody stopped to ask whether the price kept climbing past what they could actually afford, and Troy knows exactly what it's sitting on, which is why the walls are the way they are. You don't build fortifications that size to protect a small trading town from opportunistic raiders. You build them because you know you're the most valuable target in the region, and you've priced that risk into your infrastructure from day one. Every extra course of stone on those walls is Troy's own version of insurance, driving up the cost of the hostile takeover so high that, on paper, it should never have been worth attempting at all. And here's the part the myth conveniently skips. The acquisition went through, and it still didn't work out. Whatever actually happened at Troy, the timing lines up with something much bigger going wrong across the entire region. Within a few decades of the war, the whole Eastern Mediterranean economy goes into freefall. Major empires disappear, big trading cities get abandoned wholesale, and back on the Greek mainland, the same kind of centralized, bronze-hungry kingdoms that funded this whole expedition start collapsing too. one after another, taking their palace administrations and their entire economic system down with them. It wasn't one dramatic event, it was a supply chain that had been stretched to its absolute limit by a decade-long war, meeting a run of bad harvests and disrupted trade routes it no longer had the slack to absorb. Picture it as a portfolio. Every kingdom that sent ships to Troy was a separate, independently financed position in the same overall bet. A shared bet that this specific trade corridor was worth a decade of leveraged spending to control. When the broader market they all depended on took a hit, it didn't matter that some of those kingdoms had won their individual position. The war hadn't diversified anyone's risk. It had concentrated every single participant's balance sheet into the same fragile supply chain at the exact moment that supply chain buckled. A portfolio where every position is correlated isn't a portfolio. It's one bet wearing several different coats of paint. And when it fails for everyone holding it at once. And remember the governance problem from the start of this. A loose coalition of independent kings with no shared treasury and no enforcement mechanism was fragile enough during the war itself. That same structure is even worse equipped to handle a shared crisis afterward. There's no central authority left standing to coordinate a recovery, no pooled reserve to draw on, no mechanism to bail out a weaker kingdom before its collapse drags down its trading partners too. The exact feature that let this venture get off the ground in the first place, a coalition instead of a single command structure, is also the reason nobody was positioned to manage the fallout once things went wrong. Put simply, the same coalition that could fund a fleet in a 10-year siege turned out to be exactly the kind of over-leveraged operation that couldn't survive a single supply shock at home. The war didn't just run over budget. It ran the entire portfolio into the ground on the way out. And the winners personally felt every bit of it. Agamemnon, the guy who ran this whole campaign, gets murdered in his own house almost the second he walks back through the door. A decade of absentee leadership had apparently given his own household plenty of time to plan an exit that didn't involve him. Odysseus spends another 10 years just getting home. And when he finally makes it, he finds his own estate has been quietly strip-mined in his absence. A house full of suitors burning through his herds and stores while they wait him out. That decade-long return trip is genuinely its own case study. A king with a functioning kingdom back home, watching that kingdom's economy get quietly cannibalized by squatters for a full decade while he's stuck fighting monsters and stalling on an island, which is a video in itself, but the short version for our purposes here. Practically every returning commander in this story comes home to some version of the same problem. The war ends, and only then does the real bill show up, in the form of a kingdom that has spent a decade running itself without you, and doesn't especially want you back. So let's put a number on this the way you'd actually underwrite the deal. Call it 100,000 men in the field, funded by dozens of separate kingdoms, each fronting its own ships, troops, and bronze with no shared treasury, and no way to split the cost evenly. No kingdom is writing one check. Every single participant is separately financing its own slice of a shared decade-long war, with zero guarantee anyone else stays solvent long enough to see it through. Feeding that many people for 10 years, with no reliable supply line, isn't a rounding error on anyone's balance sheet. It's the kind of spend that either pays off spectacularly or quietly wrecks every party that financed it. And there's no dividend, no shared upside, just each kingdom eating its own losses while hoping the plunder covers the gap. In the optimistic case, the one the myth actually sells you, the coalition lands with total unity, overwhelms Troy fast, and everyone sails home richer than when they left. Exactly what should happen if the money had been there from day one. 10 years of spend but a clean exit. The choke point changes hands, trade flows freely again, and every kingdom that fronted ships gets its cut of the recovered wealth on the way out. In the realistic case, akromesia, the actual Greek word for having no money, which is what the ancient source uses to explain the whole mess, forces half the army into farming and raiding for the entire run, turning a war into a decade-long drain nobody budgeted for. Every extra year is another year of a kingdom's working-age men absent from their own fields, another year of stored wealth burning down with no fixed end date, another year of political rot building back home while the king's away closing the deal. Run that for a full decade, and you're not looking at a costly but successful acquisition anymore. You're looking at a campaign where the cost of closing the deal quietly exceeded what the deal itself was worth, for almost every kingdom involved except the one or two who got the best of the plunder. The fleet that eventually does sail home is carrying commanders straight back into kingdoms already destabilized by a decade of absentee ownership. right as the entire regional economy they all depend on is heading into its own collapse. The gap between those two outcomes isn't measured in glory. It's measured in whether the kingdom that funded this thing still exists in recognizable form 5 years later. And for most of them, it didn't. So if you're picturing yourself as the king launching this fleet, here's the actual lesson once you strip out the gods and the romance. It was never a war about a woman. It was a leveraged, decade-long acquisition of a trade choke point, financed by coalition partners who couldn't really afford the campaign they started, that technically closed and still managed to bankrupt almost everyone who signed the term sheet. The horse gets all the credit. The real story is the invoice nobody was tracking, and the 10 years it took for the bill to come due.